Drop Copilot in as well. Okay. Okay, so welcome everyone to the May 2024 Microsoft 365 Modern Management Meetup. So this month, a few of our other hosts aren't available because they're like, I think we're all traveling at the moment. But seeing that I'm traveling, but still in Australia and only half an hour behind where I'd normally be, we thought it would be better just to sort of go ahead with this session rather than delaying it, because we wouldn't have been able to do it next week. I think the following week would have been the earliest. So we just decided that we'd go ahead with it as is. And then that way, anyone who can join can join. So that means that I'll sort of have to sort of do things like monitor chat as well as going through the content. So but again, like when it comes to chat, like either if you want to use drop something into text chat, if you want to unmute, like unless we end up having a pretty big group, and I don't think we're going to have a ridiculously big group, so I don't think it's going to be too much of a problem. Like I think we'll probably have 20 to 30 at most. So we can, so basically we can just sort of make it as interactive as need be. Like I don't have like an absolutely set amount of content that I want to get through. It's more a matter of how much time we've got is going to be the important piece here. So let's jump on in then. So my name's Mark O'Shea, and if you want to reach out to me, just do that. Just do a search for me on LinkedIn or on Twitter. At InTunedIn is how you can get a hold of me. So for today's event or today's sessions, we're really just sort of focusing on one main topic, which is not Copilot for Microsoft 365, but it's the preparation of your environment for Microsoft 365 Copilot, which are two very different things. And we'll get into that discussion as we go through. But that was why I was trying to be somewhat careful with the wording that I was using in the meetup text, because I know it's easy to turn a message into something that you think is the thing that you want it to be. But I just wanted to make sure that it was, for anyone who's joined, is that, we're really focused on what you need to be doing at the tenant to prepare for Copilot enablement of users, as opposed to how do you actually prepare the users themselves. But we'll sort of get a bit more specific about that as we go through. Now, the other things in here, just we'll jump into introductions in a moment. I think we've got some new people attending, or at least I think probably like a third to a half of the people who registered for today look as if they were new members. We'll talk about some upcoming events. And then after we go through the Copilot conversation, that's where we just sort of stop the session recording. So if anyone's got any questions that they want to ask that they don't necessarily want them being recorded, just in case it's a bit sensitive, or maybe you don't know if it's a good question or not, you've just been a little bit gun shy about asking. That's what we cover in that general discussion section. So really here, just the first thing then is just if there's anyone who is joining us for the first time, feel free to unmute or drop a message over into the chat window just to let us know who you are, where you are, where in the world you are, because I know that, even though mostly we do get people from Australia because of the time zone, we also do get, a few people joining from around Europe due to it being something that a lot of people can attend, at a decent time in the morning. And then just sort of also a note around what your role is. So what keeps you busy on the Microsoft 365 side on a day-to-day basis, just so we can get a bit of a feel for who's in attendance, and what are some of the types of things we might need to focus on. But if anyone does want to unmute to chat, please do so. Now, Phil, I haven't seen you for a while, but I remember you, Phil.
I remember you, Mark. How could I forget you?
So I was wondering when you'd make a reappearance.
Well, for this topic, how couldn't I? This is a top topic.
Yeah,
this is an absolute ripper.
Yeah, this one, this has been my life for the last 2 months. So I'll be able to get back to more of a security focus as of Friday. But for today and tomorrow, compliance and information protection is really, for reasons that we'll sort of get into as we go through the tonight's content. Yeah, it's kind of obvious why, that is purview is such an important piece of this conversation. Not the
Absolutely.
only piece.
And I want to give great thanks to you and Steve for your help. I was at Apple the other day and doing a demonstration of Copilot, their store on a Mac and on a iPad device. And that might sound surprising from a Microsoft guy, but it was very much, again, probably the things you're going to talk about, but it does work on a Mac and it does work on an iPad. And it's really good to see Apple seeing that Intune's the way to manage the world.
Yay. Okay, anyone else? You can see we've got some typing going on, or I thought we had some typing going on in chat. But if we don't have anyone else wanting to sort of pipe in, let's just continue on. And if I do sort of see anything pop up in chat, I'll switch back over to that quickly. Now, just one event to talk about at the moment, which is towards the end of June. Jose's running Workplace Ninja Australia Melbourne for the second time. So like the Sydney one that was held recently, this is going to be a full day event. So if you either are in Melbourne or you think you can get to Melbourne for the day, let me just grab that URL and drop it into chat for you. So that way, I don't know if he's published didn't check to see if he's published the agenda yet, but I think he's pretty close to locking the agenda down so that if it is something that you look at and it is something that you think is going to be worthwhile for you to get to, if he hasn't published it yet, I think he'll be doing it pretty soon. I think Jose, the event organizer, is traveling as well at the moment. So yes, I don't think we'll see him pop up in tonight's session. Okay, so with that, that means that we can get into, I guess, the primary topic, which is the Copilot for Microsoft 365 tenant preparation. Now, we can, in a lot of ways, we can probably summarize this whole conversation, or not the whole conversation, but a huge portion of this conversation with the word data, because a lot of the preparation that really needs to take place when we're talking about Copilot so I'll just say Copilot tonight, but when I'm saying Copilot, it's not which Copilot, it's specifically Copilot for Microsoft 365 that I'm talking about. So I'll just say Copilot as a generic term for Copilot for M365. Oh, okay. So thanks for dropping that into chat. So so obviously, like Microsoft 365 is an area where there's a really high demand for skills there, because for a lot of organizations, it's either something where they're kind of, some have been there for a while, but I think one of the things that I always have to remind myself is that a lot of organizations are nowhere near as far along basically their M365 migration or adoption as I like to think people are. Like, I tend to work on the assumption that everyone has already done it because of the people that I talk to on a daily basis. But I know the reality is that there's, there are a lot of people out there, a lot of organizations out there that haven't really, done much in that area yet. And probably one of the big challenges here that I think is probably just becoming a bigger and bigger challenge as we move on with just saying Microsoft 365 is that it's something that is becoming quite overwhelming in terms of just how much is in it. And even as we go through some of the content that we've got coming up, like I've kind of put specific filters in place in terms of things that we will and we won't discuss, just because there's so much potential to go off track into other M365 content that's not specifically related to this Copilot conversation. But with that said, that ties in well with the first part. So one of the things that I've been enjoying doing recently, and I think I did this at the Sydney Ninja Workplace event, was putting in a disclaimer slide at the beginning to not to say that, if you're easily offended or anything like that, then maybe it's time to tune out, but instead just to sort of set the stage for what is going to be covered. Because as I mentioned, it's pretty easy for someone to look at something and go, oh, they're talking about Copilot. Obviously, they're talking about prompts and how to engage with it inside of applications and all that kind of thing, which if it was a regular Copilot session, then yes, that would be the conversation. But in this case, you can see that, some of the things that we're not really focused on, we're not going to be talking about other Copilots, except for we are going to talk about one of the other Copilots, but it's one that's tightly closely related to what we're covering tonight anyway. We're not going to be talking about things like end user readiness. We're not going to talk about, organizations who are trying to track adoption and usage inside the organization. These are things that, obviously are still important parts of the conversation, but not really, what it is that we want to, get through in tonight's content. And obviously tying into that is things like, we're not going to be going through and, talking about how do you handcraft the perfect prompt to get the results out of the content that you really want. So let's then talk about at a simple view. And I know that this is an approach that on the next slide, I won't get into it yet. I just want to set the stage for it, is one of the things that I've seen has been quite different with Copilot versus a lot of other technologies is, in a lot of cases, this has been a very organizational-led approach versus the technology partner being the one who is in there trying to push the customer to adopt. And there's no right or wrong approach about it, but one of the things that's really important here is that if we sort of take a look at a really simple way of looking at, well, how do we actually deploy Copilot for Microsoft 365 in our environment? So 1, we buy licenses for it. 2, we assign the licenses to users. And 3, we profit because users are instantly more productive. Now, there's a few problems with this. Step 1 and step 2, they're kind of okay, but there are a lot of other things we really should be going through before we're even assigning licenses to to a lot of users. We should be looking at things like setting up pilots, etc., and we'll talk about some of those things. But probably the big thing that we have to remember here, and this is something that when I mention it to groups of people, there's always at least one person who is somewhat terrified when I talk about the next piece, which is, what you have to remember when you're working with Copilot here is that because so let's be very, very specific. So when you're working with Copilot for Microsoft 365, you're basically allowing it to go through and build its own index, the semantic index. So basically, it's building an index based on your Microsoft Graph content. It's including information that it's finding in your SharePoint indexes and things like that. And it's figuring out all the relationships between those things so that if it sees things like projects, that it keeps seeing references to certain things, it can start trying to put 2 and 2 together to figure out, okay, well, if you're asking about a particular project, we think we found some information that actually describes what that project is. So if you ask me, what is this project? It can actually start giving you that information. Now, that's the bit that people like hearing. What people don't like hearing is basically the next piece, which is generally going to be a weakness in a lot of people's environment, which is any content that a user has got read access to across their Microsoft 365 environment is potential content that Copilot is going to include when you're asking it to create content for you. So this is one of those things where I've seen a few situations where people go, well, hang on, well, isn't it dangerous if everything the user has read access to, then Copilot has read access to? But what that really means when people are saying that is we haven't done a good, yet alone a great job of going through and securing our information properly. Now, what do I mean by that? It's like you may have done a great job of preventing, making sure that guest users and external users only get what you want them to have, but it's more the issue around how well are things protected with internal content. So for me as a regular user inside of an organization, how many different SharePoint sites could I access that I don't really need access to? And the perfect example of this is someone saying, but what if the HR team have got like an HR spreadsheet that includes a bunch of user data, including personal details, salary, and all that kind of things. So that's and that's something where it's like, well, if I can access that through Microsoft Graph, I've already got access to it. All Copilot's doing is making it easier for me to find, to access that content. And the reality is that, so Phil, I'll hand over to you in a second with this one. And I've got a really good example that I'll use in a moment too. But with things like this, it's you've already got access to a lot of this. And any of you who've used Microsoft Delve previously, and you've done searches. Now, Phil, I'll give you an example. I won't tell you who the organization was, but they have a habit of using, for non-FTEs, they have a habit of giving them things like V-T-B- accounts, and their name rhymes with, no, I won't tell you what their name rhymes with because it's a little bit too obvious. But
oh dear, I'm pretty obvious already, mate.
yeah, but the last time I had basically a business account, like a guest account, I jumped into Delve and I was just searching for random things to see what would turn up. And trust me, I was seeing business plans and release plans that I should not have been able to see. And it wasn't Delve's fault. It was because people were practicing really poor hygiene when it came to securing their content. To date this and to give you an idea, a little bit more of a hint. Actually, no, I won't give you a hint. I won't tell you the code name that I searched for, because that would just be, that one would probably get me in trouble. But it was one of the first things that made me realize that, when you think about organizations, regardless of how technically competent you think they are as an organization in terms of the skills that they have. And this may, I'm not saying this is a bad thing. Somebody who's really, really good at doing one thing, even if it's involving IT and technology, etc., it doesn't mean that they're necessarily good at going through and making sure that content is secure. And this is something that I think for most organizations who haven't really had much of a focus on compliance previously, I think they're going to be quite surprised at how much work they really have to do in the long term. So not short to medium term, but in the long term, what they need to do to make sure that that they really do have a good environment for Copilot or another AI solution to actually go through content and make sure that people are only getting data from sources that they should be getting data from. Okay, so Phil, over to you.
Thank you, mate. You've actually opened my mind to another example. I'll try and keep it short. First would be to point out that at least they're using Microsoft 365 Copilot, that their business data stays within their business. And I draw in stark contrast something like a ChatGPT-based service, which is open domain, where your documents become everybody's documents, your conversations can potentially become everybody's conversations. Use that example for a business plan, a marketing plan. And I know of Australian companies who've used ChatGPT for creating marketing plans, and their competitors just said, show me the marketing plan. And it's been there. So, okay, so great. So now you've realized Copilot's a good place to be, and Microsoft's a good place to be to keep as you talked about, the Microsoft graph. But unfortunately, I've seen two really bad examples of where people have just deployed the Copilot licenses with none of what you're going to talk about. One was a private school in Sydney, where they activated it across their student population, the teaching population, the administrators in the company as well. And everything was great. Students were doing creative writing and solving maths problems, and administrators were getting good insights to the performance of their staff and the activities of the staff, until one student said, show me the salaries of all the teaching staff. And absolutely what you said, Mark, it was read accessible and the students could get that information back.
Yeah,
my last
of course,
one.
That's the first one. That's the first thing you're going to ask it.
Yeah, tell me the salaries of the teaching staff or the senior management or the executive and the board. The next one was more tragic. This is again here in Sydney, a construction company. It's only a small company, about 30, 35 employees, a few construction workers, office staff, managers. And a construction worker said, give me a list of all the female employees under 35. And it simply had access to all those HR documents, which had age in them. and had phone numbers in them. And it built that list for that individual who then mailed it to his mates. Now, fortunately, that organization did have DLP activated. I'm sure you're going to talk about DLP.
Yeah.
Or people on the call know about DLP. The alarms went off and they said PII data left the organization. But what should have been done is many of the disciplines I'm sure you're going to talk about in preparing the tenant with sensitivity labeling and classification of documents. Read access, yes, but only to the files that you should have access to.
Yeah.
Thank you for letting me share those two stories, Mark.
No, that's, yeah. And that's the, like, yeah. And I guess that's the thing that's important. Yeah. There's a few important things in there. Like, so, you know, and we'll definitely be drilling into, you know, some of the things that should be done, you know, at least, you know, what, or at least how can you plan for some of these things? And yeah, and that's probably the big thing here is that, you know, it's planning for things that a lot of organizations have never done before. And I think the other thing that I think is a bit of a factor here, at least in Australia, is if an organization is under $5 million of annual revenue, basically they've been, they effectively haven't had to worry about any kind of issues around data breaches or things like that. They don't have any legal liability for it, but that's something that is changing. So larger orgs have had to get things under control for a few years now, but a lot of smaller orgs have been able to fly under the radar, and that's something that is definitely changing. And I think that's working its way through legislation at the moment. I don't know when that change is coming through, but it's something that I think like middle of last year that those discussions started.
Yeah, Privacy Act was updated, Mark, and it's now $300,000 penalty even on a small business director for not securing data.
Yeah, so if anyone goes, oh, compliant, why do we have to worry about compliance? It's never been a problem before, and it's like, well, it's going to be for you at some point. Okay, so with that then, let's switch over to, you know, what are some of the things here? Now, you know, because I just sort of want to present today's conversation through a particular lens. So, you know, so not doing it from end user productivity perspective, not doing it from organizational readiness, really here, you know, just sort of starting off with a bit of a broad list of things that are potentially, you know, things you should be looking at. Now, I'm not saying that these are all the things that you need to look at, but they're definitely some of the things that you need to look at. Now, the good news here is that the better the state of your Microsoft 365 tenant in terms of, you know, what have you enabled, you know, what protections have you put in place? Are you using labeling at all? You know, have you even configured labels? Do you have DLP in place? All these kinds of things. There's, you know, for an organization that's just practicing good practices in general, even if they're just being super careful with things like permissions, then they're really already a long way towards, you know, being able to roll out Copilot pretty easily without it being, you know, too much of an overall concern. But obviously for an organization that's kind of got a ton of licenses, and, you know, even if we, you know, one of the things that I think is potentially going to get the blame for a few things that go wrong in the future, and I think there's probably going to be an element of truth to it, is like there was quite a big uptick in terms of adoption of quite a few different Microsoft 365 services during the early days of COVID. So, you know, probably the big one there was, you know, a lot of Teams deployment plans, like things that were like, over the next 6 to 12 months, this is what we're going to do for you. It's like, well, we've got to try to get at least some of that done in the next 6 to 12 days kind of thing. So for a lot of organizations that sort of had some grand plans about, you know, putting a lot of the appropriate controls and structure in place, COVID threw a lot of those things out the window, and people don't necessarily go back and address the issues that they know are in the environment. In a lot of cases, people move over to a new organization, they leave, you know, it's like, okay, those issues aren't mine anymore. I don't need to worry about them. Maybe I need to clean up new issues in the new org that I'm working with. But if we take a look at some of the things in here, like we won't go through all of these tonight, but I've made sure that I've opened up a few parts of the Purview and Defender portals, so we can jump into a few of these things. There's also a few things that I'll sort of walk through over in the M365 Admin Center as well. But the important thing to sort of think about here is when you're sort of looking at this and going, well, like, basically, we're kind of all over the place in this list in terms of what technologies, what are the back-end services that they're working with. And that's the reality of when you are prepping your environment for Copilot, is that there are a lot of these different things that if you really want to put good controls in place, then this would be, this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what you need to think about. Now, just a few of the things that I do want to talk about that I've got included in here that we'll have as a bit of another conversation towards the end of the session. And this ties into something that Phil mentioned in terms of, like, what about organizations that are saying, look, we want to standardize on using Copilot for Microsoft 365. How do we stop people from using other, AI services that are out there? So we'll jump in a little bit later and talk about, how we could use something like Defender for Cloud Apps or Defender for Endpoint to go through and start configuring some of those pieces. But also there are going to be things like app protection policies, endpoint or DLP policies, etc., that we can put in place to make sure that data can't get to the locations that we don't want it to get to. And in this case, the locations, we're not talking about physical locations. Basically, it's going to be, what are the SaaS apps that, people may want to start dropping some of the corporate content into, and how can we actually prevent some of that? So, so there are kind of two different parts of this conversation. Most of it is going to be around protecting things within your tenant, but then we also need to think about, well, what happens when people try to take stuff outside of the tenant as well? Because that's where all of a sudden, if you're feeding your content into an external publicly available service, and they're saying anything we ingest becomes part of our large language model for anyone else, that's where you start running into issues like, the business plans, basically being available to your business plan being available to the general public. Okay, so then as we get into where we need to sort of think about these conversations, so just to sort of show you, there's a few different things that I want to talk about on this slide, but let's sort of just start off with this first piece here, which is over the last, I think, like within the last month or so, I think, or approximately the last month, one of the changes that occurred here in terms of where you could who you could assign Copilot for M365 to, it expanded quite dramatically. So previously it was effectively, I think it was like Office 365, E3 and E5, and sort of combine, and basically variations, including like your A plans, etc., as well as Business Premium and Business Standard. So in your M3, so basically it was M365, E3, E5, Office 365, E3, E5, Business Premium and Business Standard. So that's basically what you had to use previously, so up until around a month ago. Now, the thing to sort of note with all of those options that that I just mentioned is all of them are plans or editions or bundles, whatever, SKUs, whatever you want to call it, that included or that do include the desktop apps. But what you'll notice now is with things like the introduction of the frontline worker plans, so F1, F3, you've got E1 in there as well as Business Basic. All of a sudden, you've got plans that don't include the desktop apps. Now, let's translate that in terms of the way that I look at this, because I don't really think of the desktop apps as being the thing that determines how we should approach this. Now, obviously, in terms of deploying the apps, that's going to be an important part of the conversation. But the reason I've got it split like this is if we think of column A and column B as being things that we would approach them in a similar way in terms of how do we do our tenant preparation. And what I mean by that is that these, regardless of there being things in here called Microsoft 365, everything in here, in my opinion, my view, are things that I view as Office 365 plans. So that used to be Office 365 Business Basic, and then it got rebranded as Microsoft 365 Business Basic, the same as this. So what that means is that when we start talking about things like Purview or Entra ID P1, P2 type capabilities, then basically that's where we're getting over to the second two columns. So that means that these columns, we've got a lot more controls that we can put in place. Now, that also means then that that there are still things that we need to do here, but we're not going to get that flexibility that we get over here. We're not going to get the granularity that we get here, but it doesn't mean that column A and column B are going to be, left in the lurch as far as, not being able to get anything done. Now, there's, let me just drop I drop that URL in? No, so let me just drop this URL in first. Okay, so as I'm sort of just dropping this into chat, so the important takeaway with this is with that expansion of the plans, what they're effectively telling you here is even if you're using the mobile apps or just the web app versions of, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, etc., you are still going to have a very good Copilot experience. Now, I kind of struggle to see where if, let's say, especially when we look at things like maybe an F1, an E1, or a Business Basic, which are kind of, let's say, the cheapest versions of the plan within their family, I'm kind of struggling to see organizations that want to give people those really cheap options. I don't really see them adding Copilot for M365 licenses that are potentially going to be, maybe 3 to 4 times the cost of their underlying M365 or Office plan. But if it's something that makes sense, obviously that's something that the organizations can do. Now, the other thing that I just sort of want to drop in here, and this is something that I don't have a good answer for, and I'm sure Phil has had to have this conversation too many times, so I'm not going to throw Phil under the bus on this one. But so let's just sort of go back to the slide for a moment, then we can come back to that web page. So one of the big challenges that you will face when you start saying, okay, well, what if we have a mix of things from these columns along with things like these columns, or even over here, what if we've got a mix of E3 and E5 where people are getting different capabilities? Now, some of the capabilities you can target to specific groups of users. So that's an easy conversation. But then there are going to be certain things that you can't target to groups of users. So let's say over here, one of the things that we could say is, okay, if let's just work on the assumption, it may not be accurate, but just assume that it is. Let's assume that everyone over here gets some kind of, or at least some of the people here get like a Defender for Office 365 capability around things like safe attachments, which means that if we could enable that at the tenant, which means that everyone in the tenant would benefit from that. But there are going to be people in these columns who don't have that capability or don't have that license, and there are people over here who don't have that license. But I'm sure you all know, you've all experienced it where, enabling certain things at a tenant doesn't mean that it's only going to be restricted to people with that license. So for any of those kinds of conversations, the best thing I can sort of suggest to you is talk to your Microsoft licensing person, so whether, so if you're a customer, like, who works with a reseller or your deployment partner, if you're a customer, talk to your deployment partner. If you're the deployment partner or reseller and there are some things you're not sure of, talk to your distributor. If you're a distributor and there are things like this that you're not sure about, talk to your Microsoft licensing rep, just to make sure that you're covered here, because it's not unique to anything we're talking about here, but it's something where, questions about how do I prevent accidental mislicensing isn't always as easy as you would like it to be. Now, even this document or that page that I just had up here, let's just switch back over to this one quickly. So this document has gone, or this page has gone through a few different variations. And one of the things that we can sort of see up here, now this is where I will go back to Phil. So Phil, remember that there used to be that, so this is the current version of, remember that tenant level services licensing documentation?
I do.
Where it was giving some really, let's say, questionable guidance.
Yes.
This is the current version of that. But what you'll notice,
and it's just as questionable.
No. So the good news here is they are telling you no. So basically so the reason why that other document, let's say the predecessor of this one, that I'm sure that old link would still redirect through to here, but it sort of gave guidance on how to do the restrictions. But after each and every one of those things, I think it basically said something along the lines of, this is not official licensing documentation. Please speak to your Microsoft rep. Whereas in this case, what they're doing instead, and let me use an example here, and this is one of the big reasons why I use this one. So let's take a look in here, and if we do a search for business premium, there's a few bits at the beginning where I don't really want to go through it. So let's just sort of skip down until we can get to, some of the more interesting pieces in here. So in this case, let's say if somebody's saying, look, I'm looking at this compliance and security stuff, and I'm trying to figure out what the difference is between, what does business premium, not include that E3 include, M365 E3 includes, for example. And what you'll find as we go through this, let's just keep jumping down. What I really like about this version is that it just goes through and says, here's the feature, and here are the licenses that it's included with. So they're not talking about how to restrict it in the tenant or anything like that, because I think whoever put that initial version together, I think they had their heart was in the right place, but their brain, I don't know where their brain was. I think their brain didn't go to work with them that day.
Yeah, I think the very broad single sentence within the third paragraph of that original document was something along the lines of, other users may benefit from the service, but you need to license those to whom you wish to provide that benefit.
Correct. Yeah, and this one...
And so anybody in a tenant is going to benefit from these tenant level services. Yes. But that simple guidance was, you will need to license if they benefit. Now, how do I know they're benefiting or not?
Correct. Yeah.
So now you're saying, this is good. It's an update learning for me. They're saying you need to provide this license if you wish to provide that benefit.
Yeah. So, and so in this case, the thing that I really like about this one is that, so the example that I'll use here is that, I just want to compare it to, so business premium against M365 E3. So from this point onwards, as I go through this list, what you'll see here is that anytime there's a reference of business premium, then E3 will also be referenced. And that's the kind of thing I want to see, because it means that, look at that, business premium, E3. So we're talking about retention policies. If we get to the next one, business premium, E3. So effectively, this makes it a lot easier for you to track, what license do you need? Now, there are also some incredibly large and confusing PDFs that really break all of this stuff down on a feature by feature basis. So not just at the top level categories like we're seeing here, but on a feature by feature basis. But I think this is a good starting point. And for any of you who, especially if you do work with business premium, one of the challenges I think we've always had with that version is trying to get accurate documentation that doesn't just compare it to business standard and business basic, but that also compares it to like E3, for example. And that's something that this document does a really good job of. So that one, I think I've pasted that one in, but so this page has got a history that was somewhat questionable, but this version of it, I guess there were some things that I saw that were actually, even some of the things that I saw previously that, so there are still some things in here that I think are maybe a little bit questionable. But what I think though is that it's a hangover from when you used to have the compliance add-on, also things like the security or compliance add-on for E3 to take it to E5, where E3 used to be the base, whereas now you can pretty much add it to anything. They haven't really reflected those updates in here, but otherwise it's, I think, pretty much everything that's in here generally looks pretty good. Now, okay, so let's not spend too much more time on that. But this is the kind of thing that I mean by, anyone who's sort of getting thrown into or looking at Microsoft 365 for the first time now, it is a big complex set of products. Like, anyone who tells you otherwise is lying to you. Anyone who says, oh, you'll get up to speed really quickly, they're also lying to you. Or that maybe they're not lying to you. Maybe they do not have a good understanding of what Microsoft 365 actually means in terms of just this overall scope and comprehensive capabilities that are in there. Okay, so let's start the conversation now then in terms of what would be a starting approach in terms of what can we do in our tenant at a top level? to start getting ready, regardless of which regardless of which O365 or M365 license do we have, what would be a good approach that we could actually start off with there? So again, something that's a good part of this conversation here is that, a second change that's sort of come, so something that's become available in preview within the last few weeks is something down here called restricted SharePoint search. Now we're going to spend the next 5 to 10 minutes talking about what this is, what it isn't, but let's take a step back first of all and say, okay, we're getting started, and it's like we take a look at something like the Copilot for M365 assessment, and or even without that, let's sort of think, let's start off with a good question, with the easy question. Is our data ready for Copilot? So are people only going to see the things they need to see? And if the answer to that is no, then we are not ready to deploy. However, what we could then start doing is saying, okay, well, let's enable restricted SharePoint search. Now, what you'll see on some of the upcoming slides is that we can actually do a few of these things at the same time. So depending on the size of the organization, the resources that they're willing to throw into it, is there can be people going, okay, well, look, while some of us are handling things like permissions and labeling and all that kind of thing, other people can be looking at things like the SharePoint structure and determining who should be getting access to what in the tenant. So in this case, it's a matter of, we could just say, so even in here, if we talk, let's just go back one slide. And if we take a look at column A and column B again. So for people using these, or for people in this world using these products, then not saying that this is the only thing that they can do, but what you can see here is that as soon as we start getting into the optimize further, you can see that things like sensitivity labels and DLP come into play. And then, but this is where people in those first two columns aren't going to have these capabilities. So they've got a smaller toolbox that they need to work in. Now, it's not to say that restricted SharePoint search is the only tool that they have at their disposal, but it's the main tool that they're going to be relying on until they really sort out permissions and things like that. Whereas people who in column C and column B products, then they've got a lot more flexibility when it comes to how they can approach it because of what they can do with sensitivity labels and DLP. And then the goal then is that, overall, then we want to get to the point where, once we've got these configured properly, we've got all of our permissions, et cetera, set up appropriately, the idea would then be to disable restricted SharePoint search. So we've mentioned restricted SharePoint search a few times already. So let's actually talk about what it is. So this was announced maybe a month and a half, 2 months ago, and it started lighting up over the last few weeks. So with restricted SharePoint search, the idea here is that it's an allow list. So we can generate a list of the SharePoint sites that we've got and determine which ones we then want to, using PowerShell, for example, go through and basically, what are the ones that we actually want? Where do we want the org-wide search to actually occur? Now, important things to note here is that when we're talking about restricted SharePoint search, we are not talking about restricted Copilot search. Instead, what you have to think of is that Copilot benefits from this. And obviously, Copilot was a big driving factor to get this thing out the door. But in this case, if we take a look, it allows us to disable org-wide search and to restrict both enterprise search and Copilot experiences to a curated set of SharePoint sites of your choice. So basically, it means that if I say, well, look, I've got 1 or 2 SharePoint sites that are really the most critical ones that I want people accessing data from, and we've put all the appropriate controls in, it's only data that should be in there, it's only people who should have permissions are in there, then they might be the ones that, effectively here, we're putting those on an allow list. Now, important things to note, though, is if a site isn't on the allow list, that doesn't mean that a user won't necessarily be able to get data from other sources. Now, in this case, you can see here that, so first of all, we could have that allow list. So with up to 100 SharePoint sites. Now, for a small organization, they might be looking at this 100 SharePoint sites and going, that's pretty much all of our SharePoint infrastructure plus more. We've got room to grow. But for a lot of larger organizations, 100 sites is an incredibly small number for them. But it's not just those sites, though. So when we start thinking about it, of what else does the user get access to? So the user will still get access to content from their frequently visited sites. So if they've already got a list of frequently accessed SharePoint sites, they are sites, and as that list gets updated, as they use different sites, they will be able to, that will be integrated with what that user is accessing. So even here, you can sort of see that it's not, I wouldn't classify it as a perfect solution, but in terms of doing some initial ring fencing, etc., it's sort of pushing you in the right direction. Now, other things that are important here. Now, we'll come back to OneDrive in a moment. So things like your Teams chats, your email, your calendar items, etc. Okay, these are things that that will also be accessible through this. So basically, that's stuff that's coming through Microsoft Graph, going into the semantic index. But here's the other thing that we need to sort of think about is, okay, what are users doing with their OneDrive locations? Now, how many of you have maybe on occasion used your business OneDrive account as a dumping ground for things, either on a temporary or not so temporary basis? Now, this is something that we know occurs because, when we sort of take a look at SharePoint usage, at OneDrive usage inside of organizations, we see a lot of people with a lot of content in there, constantly bumping up against the limits and needing to get their data store size expanded. But in a lot of cases, though, people might be putting things like their personal content in there. Other things that people do is sync their phone library, their phone photo library to their commercial OneDrive account instead of their whatever consumer account they're using, because their iCloud account was too small to back up all their photos. So there are things like that occurring where, it's not just where we need to think about keeping SharePoint keeping SharePoint more curated. We also need to start thinking about, how do we really make sure that people are using OneDrive appropriately? Now, other things that will get added that the user can sort of, can use as part of their Copilot experience. So things that are being shared directly with the user. And then in this one, files that the user has viewed, edited, or created. So if I'm going through and let's say that I've got a specific file that's sitting in a specific SharePoint site that is not on the allowed list, I can still reference that document from, let's say it's a product specification and I need to create a summary document inside of Word. If I'm using Copilot, I can point Copilot at that specific document so that it basically can generate content based on what I'm pointing it directly at. So again, with this, initially it might seem like it's going to really restrict what people can do, but it does have a lot of flexibility built in. But you sort of have to remember, though, that there's if there's a lot of junk floating around inside the organization, that this approach isn't necessarily going to remove access to all that junk content that's floating around. Okay, so this is just sort of giving a few more things, a few more points here. So so basically talking about it being a temporary solution. So we kind of mentioned that earlier. The idea here is that we really should be moving on to Purview, potentially into SharePoint Advanced Management, depending on what the requirements are. But it's really here, if we take a look at it, it's designed for organizations particularly concerned about unintentional oversharing of content. So basically, we've been deploying SharePoint sites, maybe from on-prem, we've migrated a bunch of them to the cloud. We've been doing it for years. We haven't really gone back and done good maintenance or hygiene on them. That's what that's the thing that we sort of have to think about, what that impact actually is in here. So if we take a look at the process of this, how do we actually work with it? So I've skipped a step here, but you can see here that, basically we go into SharePoint and we tell it to export a list of all the sites. And in this case, you can just see that it's like one of the Microsoft demo tenants that this has been extracted from. Then we go over and basically we need to set the SharePoint online tenant restricted search mode. We need to enable that first of all. So you can see here, basically, mode is disabled or enabled. So we'd need to enable it before we could do anything. And then from there, we can go through and basically import the sites list file URL. So if I saved that previous spreadsheet that we saw as a CSV file, then I could just point it at the updated, at whatever I've got in that list. So remember, it's limited to 100. Now, what if I just want to go through and do a couple of sites at a time? Well, I could just drop them in into the command prompt, but I don't. To me, this is just something that's asking for trouble with typos and things like that. I'd rather just use the CSV approach. And then once we've gone through and done that, oops, I just realized this slide is not there in the correct order. This should have been the second slide in this sequence, so I need to fix that. But then we can go through and just, basically just do a quick query to see, what are the sites that are, that we have actually added into that. So for a lot of organizations, this is going to be a really good starting point, especially those who just haven't done much in terms of overall hygiene inside of their tenant. And and this is something that that I just sort of want to stress with everyone is this is something, here we're like, I'm not saying that, that there's, certain organizations that are doing a really bad job of this. I would probably say that a very high percentage of organizations are doing a bad job at this. And the reason is that it's only going to be select industries, select organizations of certain sizes with certain compliance requirements that are really going to be on top of this stuff already. For other organizations, it just hasn't been it hasn't been a priority. If we take a look at what the big priorities have been over the last few years, probably for a lot of it started off as we need to start moving workloads to the cloud. And then there were, probably the next one was now we need to secure everything properly that's in the cloud. So the compliance part of the security and compliance story hasn't really been a conversation that too many people have had just yet. Okay, so now if we start drilling in a bit further now to take a look at what are some of the things that you need to think about? Now, at the top level here, we're not really going to focus on this section because we're going to just spend more time down here talking about, the technical readiness more so than the user enablement. And as we start going through some of these things, it's basically, taking a look at what are some of the issues. Now, we'll take a look at some of the places you should be looking for some of these things. But at the end of the day, a lot of this really is going to be, after you sort of move on, or if you can move on from the SharePoint restricted sites, once you do get into, the next stage, then really a lot of this is going to be very, very purview driven. So we'll just continue on. We won't go through those slides in too much detail. So just a quick note here to start off before we actually get into the meat of this slide is I just sort of want to talk about up here, whereas, previously, so back to what I was saying about, it was only up until about a month ago that the only versions of M365 or O365 that we could attach a Copilot license to were ones that included the desktop apps. So previously, this slide would have said something like, required versions of the desktop apps, whereas now it's what versions of the apps or what channels, actually, I should say what channels of these apps support Copilot. And in this case, it's basically anything that's not, the semi-annual channel or semi-annual channel preview. So beta, current channel preview, current channel, monthly enterprise. Now, I'm probably guessing that, for most of you, like in terms of at least of what you've got rolled out in your environment, I'm guessing a lot of you are probably leaning towards either current channel or more likely monthly enterprise. There could be, some of you may still be heavily focused on semi-annual channel. But the thing that I'd say here is that if you do need to stay on the semi-annual channel side for whatever reason that, it's just an organization that you work for that takes a long time to roll new things out. What you have to then think about is that, okay, well, if we're not using one of these versions of Office on the desktop, then it means that the desktop apps are not going to have Copilot integration built in. Now, that doesn't mean that users can't benefit from Copilot, because again, remember, you can access the web versions of these and leverage Copilot directly within those. So it's not the end of the world, but it's one of those things that sort of, for organizations that are on semi-annual channel because they just haven't been bothered moving, this would be, one of those things that maybe gives them a bit of a push in the right direction. But if somebody has to run, basically semi-annual channel because it takes them forever to test all of the the old add-ins and plugins and the macros that they've got, then it just means that the desktop apps they've got are not going to support Copilot. But if they need Copilot capabilities, obviously they can jump into the browsers and work with it there. So I wouldn't say that's a perfect approach, because you don't really want to say to people, hey, for some Excel things, do it in the browser, and for other Excel things, do it on the desktop. I don't know about you, but most users that I work with would not be happy with that kind of thing. So in my mind, at least for now, until somebody sort of suggests otherwise, I'd say that mostly if somebody does need to stay on semi-annual channel for whatever reason, they probably aren't necessarily the best candidate for Copilot. Now, there's an argument you could make. We're going, well, hang on, if these are people who are doing advanced things that require all of that, then they, potentially they are. And it's like, I won't argue against that. But in terms of how it would disrupt their workflow, I think it could actually be problematic. Okay, so just one thing, or a couple of things that I just want to talk about then in terms of, let's say that you're not on semi-annual channel and you want to get across to one of these versions. I'll just sort of walk you through a few of the different options that we've got. Now, obviously, we could just sort of use Intune to go through and, sorry, I'm just trying to find the browser, and I'll just sort of jump over to Intune. So we could just use Intune, to go through and basically, redeploy the M365 apps, etc. So that would be one way we could do it. But what we sort of have to remember here is that we can decouple what gets deployed to the user versus from what they actually end up with over time. So even here, if we just sort of say, for create and let's say for new policy, like we could just say, actually, that's not what I wanted. I didn't want configuration profiles here. I actually wanted apps. But yeah, so I could have just gone to apps and, updated the deployment, the app deployments I've got there. But the other thing we could do in here is if we jump into the settings catalog, we could start targeting users. And there's some of the things that I like about this approach is if we jump into here and we just do a quick search on channel, and we jump down to Office 2016 updates. So we can ignore the deprecated one. We just jump into update channel. Now, the thing that if we get out of this one, what I like about this one is that it's one of the rare places that you'll actually see some kind of admin control over actually deploying the beta channel. Now, let's just sort of spend a minute talking about these. Now, generally speaking, I'd say that for most organizations, who are going down this path, I'd say monthly enterprise channel is going to be the smart, the best option as a general statement until somebody gives me a reason why that won't work for them. Now, the big reason why I think it will work for most organizations is that the updates are predictable. It's once per month. They're roll out on Patch Tuesday. Now, we're in one of those weird months where even though, so normally this meetup normally occurs on Patch Tuesday in the US, but because this is so early in the month, Patch Tuesday is actually next week. But yeah, so basically we know when it's we know it's updated once per month, and we know when the updates are going to occur. Now, what we probably then also want to make sure though is that for at least some people in the organization, we want at least some of them to get on a more frequently updated, or at least earlier updated version. So that leaves us with three choices: beta channel, current channel preview, or current channel. Now, beta channel is beta. It's preview as in it may be supported, it may not be supported, but it's basically, things to sort of note with beta channel is new versions are pushed out pretty much every week. And work on the assumption that each week it's going to be 700 to 900 meg or so of updates on a weekly basis. So, there could be issues with that in some organizations, as well as that weekly update. Now, for the current channel preview and current channel, just sort of think of these as these are basically rolling into monthly enterprise. So basically it goes, things get tested in beta channel. So they're in preview when they're in beta channel. But when they get into current channel, even though this is called preview, This is not an unsupported like public preview or private preview like on the Azure front. This is all this preview means is that it's a preview of the current channel. So this is fully supported, etc. But what I'd say here then is for most people that are saying, look, we want to test some of these capabilities out, prior to people getting monthly enterprise versions, then generally speaking, current channel or current channel preview. Now, both of them have got the same strengths and weaknesses. We get new features rolled out earlier than monthly enterprise, but the weaknesses are the same, which is both of them, the update schedule is you'll usually get 1 to 2 updates per month, and you don't necessarily know what days of the month that is going to be. So there is some non-predictability there versus what monthly enterprise channel is, but that's the way that you can get those updates. Now, if somebody wants something that's more predictable, then I'd say, okay, well, beta channel, you do pretty much get a new update per month. So it is predictable, but obviously the data requirements are going to be problematic in some situations. Okay, so now the other thing that I just want to highlight here, which I think ties into a little bit of this conversation, is the second way that we can go through and start controlling this is through the M365 App Center or config.office.com. Now, previously, this only had monthly enterprise channel in there. So I think the last time it's been probably I'll say 6 months, but maybe it's been 12 months since we've spoken about the M365 Apps Admin Center. But what we then get in here now is the option for current. So for me, this was a little bit of a weird one that, that current was added. But now that I'm thinking about it, part of me is really curious if this is now in here because of the, basically people who want to test new Copilot features out in the desktop apps before it gets into monthly enterprise, then current is probably the best version for that. Now, technically, I don't really think it's got any kind of superior capabilities over current channel preview. Like for me, I'd probably go to preview just to get it a couple of weeks earlier. But I think the preview name is likely to scare a few people. So just sort of putting current channel on there to me would that would be my logic as to why current was added in there. The people who want it, a little bit more aggressive, but also with current, one of the other reasons why I think it makes sense for it to be in here is, once again, going back to M365 Business Premium, it's been pushing out current as the default channel since it was initially rolled out as Microsoft 365 Business. So basically that has been their go-to approach. So they have been really, really aggressive in terms of the version that they've pushed out. And, when I sort of ask partners who deal in that space, have they changed update channels? The response I normally get is, what's an update channel? Like, what is it? How would I change it? Why would I change it? So it's telling you that, there are a lot of SMBs up there who are sitting on current channel and it just hasn't been an issue for them whatsoever. Okay, so so with those, it's so a few different ways of pushing those, either pushing them out through Intune or updating them through Intune, or alternatively pushing it out through Intune and then updating it as you need through the M365 Apps Admin Center. So you get a bit of flexibility there in terms of how you approach it. But generally, I'd say be very careful with who you push beta out to, unless it's somebody who really knows, who you're targeting. But you can kind of see, current channel and monthly enterprise seem to be the ones that are really the ones that are being pushed here. Okay, so now moving on from the desktop apps, the next thing that I want to talk about here is Copilot in the Windows sidebar. So let me just pull up a VM on screen quickly so you can see this over here. So depending on what version, so I think, let me just check. I think this is, pretty sure this is 24H2. Okay, yeah, so I think if you're on 23H2, you won't get the Copilot icon here. Instead, you'll get the Copilot icon like here alongside search, for example. But what I just want to sort of show you quickly in here, there's two different things that we can see in here. And this is something that I think is definitely going to cause some confusion. So the first thing that you can see here is that it's already gone through and integrated directly into my Copilot for Microsoft 365. So this tenant that this client is in does have Copilot for Microsoft 365 enabled, or at least for one user, me anyway. So it's very clear that that is the work, that is, my work account that I'm signed in. But the other thing over here is if I jump over here to web, the thing that you'll notice up here is that it's got protected at the top. And so what that means is that it's using the version of Copilot called Copilot with commercial data protection. So any of you who ever took a look at Bing Enterprise, Bing Enterprise Chat, this is Bing Enterprise Chat rebranded. So now it's Copilot with commercial data protection. So what they're basically saying there is that anything that you're dropping in here, when you see that protected icon, it's letting you know that it's but basically it's not something that the learning model is going to be using to advance itself. It's something that basically is disposed of after that occurs. Now, just to sort of highlight something quickly in here is that, oops, that is not what I meant to open up. Must have been a few pixels off to the side. So something that's important to note here, let me just get all of that stuff off screen here, is that effectively this Copilot preview or this Copilot sidebar is effectively like a decoupled, I don't know if actually decoupled is probably the right word. Think of it as a decoupled version of the Copilot sidebar within Edge. So if an organization is saying, we're not using Edge, we're using Chrome or whatever, Firefox or Opera, Opera, insert any non-Edge option, then this would be the way that you could get that. Now, right now, do I think it's kind of overkill that I can get to Copilot here, I can get to Copilot here, I can get to Copilot inside of all of my apps? Yes. But if I was switching between them all on a regular basis, then I could see where it would actually, where it would make sense. For me, anyway, most of the time, working with Copilot directly inside of the apps is my happy place to be, rather than going, oh, hang on, let me pop this up to figure out how to do something. I'd rather do that inside of the app. But this is just sort of giving you options for, different people work different ways. Not everyone is going to be using the desktop app. So this is just giving you, a bit more flexibility. Now, the other thing that you have to sort of remember here is that anything you've put in place in terms of any kind of restrictions or blockers in your environment to maybe prevent this sidebar in Edge is also going to prevent it, potentially or definitely, depending on what you've done, prevent this Copilot sidebar in Windows from operating as well. So basically the way to think of it is, let me just make sure that we'll make it a bit clearer here, is this equals this. And you can kind of see in here that they're not really trying to disguise the fact that these are basically the same thing, just presented to you in slightly different ways. So if there's anything that you've done to block this, it's also potentially going to block that. Now, speaking of blocking, let's just go back to the slides. So in 23H2, it is enabled by default, but you can disable it. So basically, two of the options here, you can do it through CSP, so turn off Windows Copilot, or you can do it through this thing called group policy, which I'm sure some of you probably still have to work with occasionally. But also, let me just check, did I include? So the other thing as well, though, was that we could also enable Copilot, even if you're still running 22H2. Now, in this case, there are three different ways that we can configure it. So we could do it in Intune via a CSP policy. We can do it in the Intune settings catalog. Now, I actually think that they may have gone through and renamed what this setting is called. I'd need to validate that, but you can tell which one it is when you're in there. But basically here it's something where you're basically allowing it to add additional Windows update functionality, so Windows functionality without necessarily waiting for a new feature update of Windows. Now, I'm guessing though that most of you are either have already moved off 22H2 or are in the process of that. So I don't really think this one is going to be too much of an issue there for you. Now, the other thing that I'll just sort of quickly mention here is, so just a general question. So how many of you are running, let's say 23H2 or 24H2, but don't have the Copilot icon showing up anywhere in your environment. So are any of you in that situation where it just hasn't appeared for you? And I'm sure at this point in time, I don't think anyone would be sort of too frustrated and angry that it hadn't showed up yet. Now, the thing that I found in my test environment is it may have been self-inflicted, but in any machine that I've got in my tenant that's already running, it's not showing up. So I was working with Steve, we were sort of trying a bunch of things to see, okay, what policies, et cetera, have I got in place that may be preventing it from working? And we couldn't work on anything. And I said, okay, let me just go through and, deploy a new VM and let it go through and, basically, let it enroll, let it get all the policies. And the end result of that is that you can see here that it is definitely not a tenant issue because it's showing up over here on the client. So my best guess is I did some stuff around forcing some unsupported things with Windows Insider for Business, where I was forcing the clients onto the Canary channel, even though technically they were only supported to be on the beta or dev channel. So I've got a feeling that that's something I did is what caused that. So even those machines where I've done that, if I go through and do a reset on those, then the Copilot icon does actually show up after the process. So it's nothing in the settings. I think it's just me messing up the way some of these policies were getting pushed out, because initially it was a gradual rollout, and I think it put it into a state where it was confused by I was in Canary, but it was also a managed device on Business Insider, which basically caused that functionality to break. So at some point in time, hopefully it either addresses itself or I'll need to reset a few machines if I want that particular sidebar to turn up. I'm not too fussed about it right now because I've got multiple ways of getting to it. And this is just screenshots showing that for you. Now, if we switch over and start talking about some of the other pieces here in a bit more detail, I don't want to go through too many of these things in here. I'd rather just do some demos in here just to sort of talk about, I guess, some of the important pieces that that you do need to think about in here. So so let's not worry about going through the slides. Let's just sort of jump through a few more of the demos where I just wanted to highlight, I guess, some of the things that I think are probably worth investigating when you are looking at what you should be doing. So let's get out of slides, and we can do, and most of these I should have up and in the right location, so we can just walk through them, close them, and move on to the next thing. So the first thing then that we should take a look at is, okay, what if we're going to enable or start adding Copilot licenses to our tenant? What should we do? Now, this is a part of the M365 Admin Center I just generally don't even think about coming into. But in some situations, you probably need to. Now, in this case, this is basically here in setup. Now, a lot of the things that they get you to do in setup are things that you're probably doing in the native admin console. So things like, custom domains, MFA, Entra ID, you probably use the Entra portal to go through and do that stuff. That's the kind of reason why I don't really use setup. But if we jump into here and take a look, then we won't use the setup guide. Let's use all guides and see if we can find Copilot in here somewhere. Okay, so in this case, if we take a look at the Copilot setup, we'll go through the foundational setup, and then we'll jump into advanced configurations. Now, the last time I checked on advanced configurations, it was there was like a couple of checkbox options, but otherwise it was pretty much identical to foundations. So tonight, and so the other thing as well in here that's new is that, so previously, this is the first time that I've seen the quick start light up as new, and advanced configurations was still listed as coming, even though I could actually process it. But if we start off with, let's take a look at the simplified deployment guide first. We'll sort of run through these things pretty quickly. Oh, okay. So this is definitely new. And the reason I can tell you it's new is the fact that it's mentioning restricted SharePoint search, because that's something that has only started to light up over the last few weeks. So effectively here, if we take a look at the steps, preparing the users, you don't want to, if you drop Copilot on users without telling them what it is, they're not going to use it. They won't know what it is. They won't know how to use it. Enabling restricted SharePoint search. Now they're saying that's optional. Technically, that is correct. But we've already sort of had a few conversations around why not putting any controls in place could be problematic to start off with. Now, assigning the Copilot licenses to users and announcing that. So if we just sort of go through that pretty quickly, do we want to enable restricted SharePoint search? I won't enable that. I'll leave it disabled for now. Now, in this case, I can't actually assign any licenses because I've got a license and the license has been assigned already. So if we jump in, you'll see Copilot for Microsoft 365. I don't actually have any licenses assigned, available to assign. And this is an important thing because right now, and I'm sure some of you have sort of looked at this or asked about it, is there are no free trials of Copilot for Microsoft 365. And that's got a few interesting flow-on effects into internal and external behaviors at Microsoft in terms of how certain things are being built and how things are being done. But I just don't see, at least for the short term, I don't think Microsoft needs to offer Copilot trials because people are buying it anyway. And my guess here, based on no factual information, just based on a lot of assumptions that could be terribly wrong. So why isn't Microsoft offering free trials? Well, first of all, as I said, they probably don't need to at the moment. There's enough demand that they're happy with how many people are buying it and leveraging it. The second thing here is that free trials for something like this would have the potential to put a lot of strain on the system because we're not talking about general purpose compute in Azure that's handling this. This is all basically high performance compute capabilities. So basically, different classes of infrastructure inside of Microsoft data centers. So, and a lot of that is extremely limited extremely limited availability of things like NVIDIA GPUs and that kind of thing. So so over time, no doubt, I'm sure we'll probably see something. But we also have to remember is that the amount of work that you need to put in to really get ready for Copilot, your Copilot trial would expire before you were really able to get the most out of it anyway. You could still get some benefits out of it early on, but it wouldn't really be able to show you what it was actually capable of. Now, let's see. So let's see. Okay, so this is something that I'm still a little bit surprised by this. Welcome your users to Copilot. Each user will get an email like this. Now, I might be wrong on this, but assume even if you were preparing your users saying, hey, you're getting this thing called Copilot, how many of your users in your environment do you think would actually go through and delete an email like this because they're like, why am I getting email from Microsoft 365? They're not the people who normally contact me. Whereas even if it just had, instead of the M365 logo up there, if it had your company logo or something like that, and some slight customization, I could see this would be more likely to be read by a user as opposed to being deleted by users. Now, other things in here is pushing you out to some Copilot adoption resources. So one of the things that I think the Copilot team has done a really good job of here is they have got a ridiculous amount of adoption content out there. And I think they probably followed the lead of what Teams did. I think Teams was really the first coordinated effort I saw where they really made sure there was not just a lot of great technical documentation, but also a lot of really good end user onboarding, internal adoption, change management type content. And you'll see a lot of similar stuff here with Copilot for M365. And then as we go through that, it's, basically here, saying, okay, what have we done? Have we completed these steps? What update channel did I choose? What mobile app, if I'm deploying those. So I won't actually go through and hit done on those. I want to keep that saved as not complete. But if we jump into Foundations, Okay, in this case, you'll see, okay, once again, this has been updated because restricted SharePoint search wasn't there previously. So that's something that obviously has been added in. Now, in this case, you can see that, what it's important to note in here, and this is what I thought the big difference would be between the standard and the advanced deployment guides and assistance is, in this case, you'll see that this is really just giving you, telling you where do you go for more information. It's not actually checking your tenant to see where you are. That would be where things like the assessment tool would come into play. But this is just telling you some of the things that you would need to do. But let's just sort of talk about some of the things on this list that, or in these tabs that I haven't spoken about previously. So right now, Outlook is in a little bit of a weird place because, well, first of all, what is Outlook? Are we talking about the new Outlook? Are we talking about classic Outlook? And so in terms of the new Outlook, it has some extra Copilot integration capabilities in terms of message creation in there versus what classic Outlook has. But the problem is that new Outlook doesn't have all of the functionality of classic Outlook. And so so every now and then I'll switch over to the new Outlook. I'll keep using it until I run into an issue where it's like, oh, it doesn't do something I need. And I'll just sort of toggle the switch and go back to classic Outlook. But basically now it seems like they've said, look, we are actually going to be supporting, all of the functionality on classic Outlook at least for a while, because my take on it is the Copilot team thought that the Outlook team would be further along in terms of incorporating more or all of the classic Outlook functionality in there. Now, on the team side, probably just the main thing in here to make sure, and this is something that I think you'll probably find in a lot of your environments, is that unless you have specifically gone through and enabled transcription for certain sets of users, you'll find that inside of Teams, when they go in and they're in a meeting and they click the Copilot icon, it will basically say you need to enable transcription. Then they'll go to enable transcription, but transcription is grayed out. So just make sure that in your Teams meeting policies, so does it actually, so basically, in your Teams meeting policies, you need to enable transcription, or at least move people to a policy that has transcription enabled as opposed to the policy that they may already be on. And any of you who work inside of Teams, this is something that we're basically, in this case, we need to do it at a policy level. It's not something we're doing at a setting level that occurs across the organization. It's something that we need to do at a policy level in here for a bit more flexibility. And just to sort of show that to you, like over here, sorry, James, I'll keep you off screen. So here, because I've already gone in and so in this case, I'm recording, transcription is enabled in here. But if I jump into Copilot, you can see here that I can jump into Copilot. But if I didn't have transcription enabled, if I clicked on Copilot when I was in a meeting, it would go through and basically say, hey, you need to enable transcription. And as a user, sorry, I'll get you out of there. I know. I didn't tell you you had to be camera ready. But basically there it tells you what the issue is. It says, hey, you need transcription, but transcription can't be enabled, which means the user would need to reach out to the admin to make sure that was under control. Okay, so some other things in here talking about, establishing our best practices around, the data protection. So this ties into, the things that we sort of finishing, talking about in more detail over the next half hour or so. And in this case, more controls around what are we doing in SharePoint, what are we doing in Purview. So we'll talk about some of these things. We won't really talk too much around the SharePoint side though. We'll really focus in here on Purview. And then in terms of licenses, I can't do anything here because I've already assigned my sole license, but I actually had to open my own wallet for the good of everyone else. And again, you'll see that same message. So let's cancel out of that one, and now we'll jump into advanced configurations. And here we go. So the last time I went through this, the key difference, okay. So so there's a new difference in here. So the first thing you'll notice here for the advanced option, they've actually removed the SharePoint tenant restriction side. They're saying, yep, if you're advanced, that's not the way you're going to do this. So here you can see that the preparation, data protection, and licenses, all they're really doing here is saying, do you actually want to see all of the options? So in some ways, it's better to view, or at least for now, the advanced deployment option actually seems to be more like a configurable deployment option as opposed to the standard deployment option. Because if we keep all of that selected and we go through, you're going to see that it's pretty much the same thing. Now, just one thing that I want to quickly call out in here, because at first I really struggled with this thinking, and because it's not just here, there are a lot of places in Copilot for M365 content where they talk about how you must have an Entra ID account to authenticate. And I kept thinking to myself, well, surely if somebody's going down this path, they already know that. But then I sort of had to remember that, no, people don't necessarily know this. But also, I think the other thing we need to take into account here is because Microsoft has got so many things called Copilot, and even here, if we sort of talk about just the Copilot in that sidebar, in the sidebar, for example, if this wasn't me signing in with an Entra ID account, I could do a free Copilot/Bing integration, or I could do a paid Copilot/Bing integration. In both cases, it would be using a Microsoft account and not an Entra ID account. Or even if we think about somebody using Copilot for GitHub, then it's got different sign-in options as well. So I think here they're just really trying to make sure. Now, I have had I haven't had the strict question, but I have had a variation of a question of, can I work offline with Copilot for Microsoft 365? And that's a big no. It's a cloud. It is a cloud service. So unless you have an offline cloud service available to you, which I guess technically wouldn't be a cloud service. But otherwise, if you take a look in here, everything is pretty much the same. The same links if we went through all of this. So we won't worry. Same email announcement, same adoption pieces, etc. So again, it's something where the advanced configurations to me is if it was called slightly more advanced configurations, maybe that would do better, level setting for what I thought it would be doing instead. But as it is, it was something where I was expecting something a little bit more from that. But at least you can see here that, they are working on these, more things have been added in versus, the last time I looked at this a week or so ago. So, so progress is always a good thing. Now let's continue on. We'll close that off and we can close this one because this is the one that took us to that. So then some of the, oops, I had it open already. Okay, so some of the other things then in here is, let me keep closing. Why does it keep going back to that one? That's better. Okay, so the next thing here is if we take a look in here at usage, this is not them artificially promoting Copilot for Microsoft 365. As far as I can see, this list is in alphabetical order. Now, in this case, you can see here that I'm in that rare situation where I've got 100% usage across the different Office apps, but with one user, that's not all of that tough, to achieve. We can jump into usage. We can see some more details in here, and probably no surprise to anyone that, if there were two things in here that weren't being used, that Loop and OneNote would be those. Nothing against Loop, and definitely nothing against OneNote. They're just not things that I've got a daily use for. So in this case, you can see that it does things like hide user details so that you're not necessarily seeing, all the information about particular users, for example, and their usage patterns. But other things we can do in here is if we just jump into, where are we? Viva Engage. Actually, it's not Viva Engage I wanted. It was one of the Vivas. Which one? Viva Insights. That also gives me a bit of info. Okay, it takes me straight into it. So the Microsoft Copilot dashboard. So it shows that I've got 100% adoption because 1 out of 1 user is actively using it. So obviously in your environments, you'll be very happy when you do get to 100%, and especially if you can get to 100% usage across multiple apps. But there are different tools we can use to track that usage inside of the org. And I'll just see if there's anything else in the M365 Admin Center. Yeah, probably just one final piece in here, which is just the general Copilot section, which is showing an overview. But here's the settings piece that's important. So this is where, in this case, you can see Copilot in Bing, Edge, and Windows. So this is basically where we go through and get some information on, do we want to be able to integrate Copilot in here. So this will sort of show you how where we can do it. But what that is really just the on the user side, it's basically, do we want to enable Copilot / or Copilot Chat / Bing Enterprise Chat for them? So that's really what we're doing in here. Now, the other thing that we've got down here is improved responses with web content in Copilot for Microsoft 365. So do we want web content to be included? So if we're asking it to create things, do we actually want it to be pulling from web sources as well as our own sources? That's really what it means there. So if someone says, no, I only want our own content to be used to generate more content, then we could go through and disable that. But notice here that this is basically a tenant-wide setting. It's not, we don't get granularity here in terms of, setting at different levels for different users, etc. Okay, so we'll leave that part of the conversation there. And I'm just keeping an eye on time here. So probably just a few of the things then just to sort of quickly talk about is, before we get into Purview, let's just quickly cover off the a few other pieces, and then we can sort of ride it out for a few more minutes on the Purview side. So for the Cloud App Catalog, so any of you who are using Defender for Cloud Apps, formerly MCAS, if we scroll down to generative AI, you can see that there are already 436 entries in here. Now, I went through and tried a bunch of ones that, basically things like, document creator, AI-based document creators, AI-based presentation creators, and things like that. And I didn't see a few of them in here. Now, so obviously it's the bigger ones that are going to appear in here first. So in this case, you can see that I've got Copilot for Microsoft 365 enabled, and I've got and sanctioned. But let's say here with Copilot, for example, if I wanted to go through and unsanction that, what does it mean if I choose it, make it unsanctioned? It means that in this case, and this ties into the next part of the demo, effectively Defender down on the client is going to be bringing in a list of URLs, sites, etc., that we don't want people to be able to access. So in this case, the one that I've put in here as an example, let's just put Box in here as the example so you can see here. I tried this with Dropbox, but I just found it broke too many things, where Dropbox is just being used as a repository for lots of random things. So let's just jump in here. We should find Box in here. Do we have, let's make it unsanctioned. Okay, so here you've got Box, which I've got marked as unsanctioned. And if we just sort of jump into here, this is nothing against Box. I just wanted a commonly used storage option to sort of, that I've had this in here forever. And what it means is that in this case, it's saying, okay, here are the domains that are being blocked. And if I jump up here to the browser and I type in, box.com, effectively we get, what looks like a safe screen. And in this case, instead of it saying, hey, Microsoft has blocked this, instead it's saying the organization has blocked it. Now, where I mentioned that this ties into Defender. So if we get out of here, so we could go through Defender for Cloud Apps and start building things in there ourselves if they're not already in there. But if we don't have Defender for Cloud Apps, but we do have Intune, then what we could do in here instead is jump into, sorry, not Intune, Defender for Endpoint. We can jump into settings, endpoints, and then over here to indicators. And what you'll notice here is that the URLs we've got here correlate to what the URLs were for those unsanctioned apps. So if I said, okay, here are some of those ones that, those ones that I've found people in the organization are using, here's where I could go through and start manually adding these into here. So putting in the URL, the domain, etc., and what do I actually want to do with them. So we've got a few different ways that we can deal with that. Now, other things we could also do if there are certain AI sites that, let's say we're saying, look, we only want people using, Copilot with CDP or M365 Copilot. We want everything to stay within our tenant. Then this would be, using some of these approaches, like with Defender for Cloud Apps or here with the endpoint blocking, would be some of the, just some of the ways. Obviously, there are a lot of different ways that you could do that. So in that case, Sean, if that third-party AV app had something like that built in, but alternatively, you could, I don't know what the implications are these days of having Defender enabled alongside something else. So in this, yes, but in this case, this is something. So I guess the difference here is that it's over here on the Cloud App Catalog side. We don't need to be using Defender for endpoint there. So it just even just standard Defender can pull that information in from the Cloud App Catalog. But in this case, this is specifically if we wanted to do it directly here, that would be a Defender for endpoint capability. You'd need to check with the third-party AV solution to see, what they had in play there. Now, there are some other things that you could start playing around with here in terms of over in Intune, you could start working with app protection policies in terms of what are the trusted domains and things like that. But I think that's probably just going to generate more work and not really exactly the kind of thing it's built for. But yeah, you could potentially do it with app protection policies in Intune as well. Okay, so let's get these ones out of the way. Now, I think we don't need those two. We can get rid of that. We've seen that. Okay, so just one other thing that I want to talk about quickly here before we do get into Purview. So I'm having all my demos organized via browser tabs, very efficient. Okay, so in this case, the other part of this conversation then is, okay, should you bother deploying the AIP or Unified Labeling Client? I'm not exactly sure what it's called these days. I think Windows Update will tell me. Let's go back to that VM because I deploy an old version that I haven't updated, I think, in around 4 years, knowing that as soon as it gets it, Windows Update is going to pull down the current version. Yes, I know that's a terrible practice, but it works for me. But it's not what I would recommend. So if we jump into update history, what have we got? Yeah, okay, so it is still the Azure Information Protection Unified Labeling Client. Okay, so with that, let's just get rid of everything from the desktop here and see if I jump into show more options. Let me just create something. So let's save. Hopefully this works because I haven't actually configured it. Okay, so this is showing what I wanted. So if a user is really only working with content in like creating content or updating content in Word, Excel, PowerPoint, etc., then you may not need that unified labeling client deployed. But if you've got other apps that you're using that don't integrate with Purview/AIP, but you still want to protect the content, then in this case, this is a new VM that I built last night. So I don't know how well configured it. You can sort of see basically it's not configured. It's checking what it can do in here. But here you can see that permissions haven't been set. So what permissions do I want to put on it? So in this case, you can see basically I can apply the labels that would normally be available to me inside of. Let's just open up Word as an example. was waiting for that to light up. So basically here you can see personal, public, blah, blah, blah. For some reason, I've got one called passports in there as an example, but that does a good job of highlighting that this is basically pulling that labeling information out of Purview so that I can effectively apply it to any kind of file that I've got here. So in that case, if I want to label it, if I want to protect it, so my recommendation here would be to consider deploying the information protection client. Now, as I mentioned, okay, it's not quite, actually, look, that's close enough to me I'm pushing a 4-year-old version of this out as a Win32 package. You can see here it's intune.win. Now, the thing that I checked that I think I'll flag this as something that needs to be addressed is if we jump into apps, so even in here, even though I do have Enterprise App Catalog available to me, one of the things that I kind of assumed would be in here let's just drop Microsoft in as a filter. I kind of thought the AIP, or at least AIP/Unified Labeling Client would be in here, but for whatever reason, it's not. And considering this whole conversation, I think that's something that probably should be addressed. So I'll harass Steve. I'll tell him he's doing a terrible job. He needs to get this updated, even though it's got nothing to do with it. Okay, so yeah, so I would say this is something that I would recommend, because it means that, it's not just, it's not just office productivity content that, that you need to access. Now, some of the nice things here, and if you're not aware of it, is, do I have that VM open? So let's say here in Word, if I go through and reference a document here, so I haven't, oops, sorry, let me do it properly here. No, I don't know what documents are going. Okay, so in that case, if I go through and say, look, I want to reference a document. So in this case, this document, if this document had labeling or protection applied, then it's actually going to inherit that protection from that content into this document. So if I had this marked as internal only or public or whatever, me referencing that and saying, create a summary of, I don't know what that word was. The weird things you type when you're not sitting straight on. So the fun of sitting in a hotel room at an awkward angle with furniture. Let me just try this, see how it goes. So if this content, so as I was mentioning, if this content was content that I did have labeled, and I need to get into the habit of labeling more, just even for this kind of demonstration, is that it means that, okay, in this case, it's saying that, okay, I must already have it marked as, I didn't realize I had it marked as general. Let me just check. Or do I have, I think actually, no, I think it's because I might have sorry, I apologize. This was an accidental working demonstration. I did not mean for this to actually work that way. I didn't realize actually, or I did actually have general on that. So this is actually perfectly showing what I wanted to show you, which is that, the content created has inherited that general label. So this is where you can start seeing that, having things labeled appropriately means if somebody's pulling in something that's sensitive, it is going to tell you that, and it's automatically going to mark it as sensitive. Now, that also means then if let's say it's something that automatically gets flagged as confidential, and I said, oh, that's not confidential, it's actually public. Then at that point, if I had a policy set at the tenant level to go through and allow people to drop like I've got here. Now, in this case, I've got more admin capabilities than I really should have for what I'm doing here. But for a regular user, they would get prompted asking, why are you dropping the sensitivity? Please provide a justification for that. So in that case, so that was actually a good accidental demonstration. I didn't realize that I did have a label on that. So I'm just giving myself a little pat on the back in that case. Okay, so let's get out of that. I don't really need to save that document. Now, just some important things to note there is if you are also then going through and using the labeling policies to then go through and do document encryption as well, at least for now, Copilot is not going to bring encrypted content in. So I don't think it's a technical limitation. I think it's just more of a be beware of what content you're bringing in right now, because obviously it does have the ability to do things it's got on behalf of user rights to do a lot of this stuff. So if it can read a file that you've got permissions to, it would be also able to open an encrypted file that you've got access to. So I think just a design decision is in place there right now. So maybe we'll see some controls in the future where they start to change that. Okay, so with that, let's just get into the final piece, which is around Purview. Now, so one of the things that I mentioned earlier on was that, I view the conversation around getting started with Purview here as more of a, let me just pull up that one of the early slides that I had in here, just so we're all on the same page before I get into this. Okay, so this one. So basically, column A, column B, no Purview, or extremely limited Purview capabilities. Column C, column D, good Purview capabilities. Now, if we jump into E5, so either E5 or A5, what are the big things that we're getting in terms of Purview when it comes to, jumping up from Business Premium / E3 up to E3, E5, A5? Really, the big ones that at least for this conversation, I'm not saying these are the only things, but the big ones would be your endpoint DLP capabilities. So if we jump into policies and give me settings, please, up here somewhere, it would be nice. Hello. Oops, that was the wrong. Oh, sorry, that was a me error. I clicked on the wrong policies. What do we want? We want DLP, and up here in settings we get the endpoint DLP. Just making sure I'm calling it the right thing. So we get the endpoint DLP settings. We can also see down here somewhere. So yeah, so if I go through and say, okay, let's create a new policy just so we can see that. Don't need to worry about that. Let's just pick devices. So effectively here, it's the being able to go through and have endpoint DLP apply. And so this is part of E5. It's not something that is part of E3 / Business Premium, but they can get that capability if they do add the compliance add-on. So that would be, for me, that would be like out of, let's say top, if we sort of talk about the top 2 features, this would be one of them. I'm not saying it's number 1 or number 2, just one of them. The other one that I'd say would be part of, would be one of the important pieces here is if we, just cancel out of that. And this one causes a bit of confusion, so I want to spend a minute talking about it. If we go into information protection, and down here we've got the option of auto labeling. Now, with auto labeling, actually, I should have kept that. What was the the URL that I had previously? Let me just do I'm doing all the work I just did of closing tabs. So this one. So if we go into, I've got to be careful with the way that I search in here, because it's, I'll use auto because it's the safest thing for me to search on in here. And so it'll make more sense once I get into it. Okay, so this bit here. So if we're talking about the online services, so things here like they're talking about, SharePoint and OneDrive and Exchange online, for example, then it can do, or the online services can automatically apply labels based on policies we've assigned. But then there's another type of automatic labeling. And did I scroll past the thing that I'm, there's, okay, so the other thing that I'm looking at here, it's not actually that piece, it's information protection. Okay, it looks like they've stripped it out of that page and brought it into here, but it's the, let's start looking for no's. Okay, so this bit here, configure conditions for automatic and recommended classification. What that means is that it's not worded the best way, but what that means is that, like, if I'm creating a new spreadsheet or Word document or whatever, then the information protection capabilities can basically can take a look at what content is in that document and go, okay, well, based on us seeing like an Australian tax file number or things along those lines, we can automatically apply a label there to you. So yeah, so in that case, it's, so basically this is a different type of automatic labeling and classification that is part of the E5 license. And that is something that applies to the desktop apps, or if you're doing it in the cloud version, the Word Online, etc., it will apply there as well. So yeah, so it looks as though they have made some changes there. But in this case, everyone who's got Purview Purview information protection gets some degree of auto labeling, but you get better auto. Oh, here we go. In addition to these policies, you can automatically apply labels to Office client apps by editing the auto labeling settings for a specific label. So that's really the text that I was looking for. So in that case, that's telling you that it's the Office, basically the M365 desktop apps or Office client apps. So I knew there had to be somewhere where they were more explicit around what was there. So I'd say they're the big two differences. But what you need to sort of think about in these cases is that getting familiar with things like, and if we sort of then jump into the third one, I'm not going to click too far on this because I don't know what's going to show up in the information pane. But with Content Explorer, this is where it will sort of say, hey, look, here is what appears to be sensitive information types that we've discovered in the content that you've got. So according to this, I've got quite a bit of medication. I've got quite a few addresses. I've got lab test terms. Now, the reason why I've got all of these random things is because I dumped a bunch of sample content into my environment quite a while ago. And now you can see that a lot of this stuff is going to be a little bit problematic for me when it comes to Copilot. Copilot is going to know about things that I wouldn't have expected it to know about because of some of these things. But in this case, it's if you've got an E3 or Business Premium plan, it will give you this side. But basically, if you click on it, actually, even before you can click on anything, it will pop up and say, hey, you don't have an E5 license. Would you like a trial? So basically, there's an infomercial built in. But you do get access to Activity Explorer where you can see what's going on in terms of label usage and things along those lines. But overall, though, the other things you should be looking at, because I'm just sort of keeping an eye on time here, because as I mentioned, there's a ton of stuff we can go through with this. The things that I'd say are the big focus areas. So obviously, information protection. Now, part of the information protection, or the thing that sort of is the first thing you should get familiar with, is data classification. Depending on whether you've got E5 or not, there are different capabilities that will be available. But even without E5, you've got a lot of capability. Then up next, I'd say things like probably information protection, because the labels here, we can start potentially inheriting the work we do up here with the data classification. And the same then applies to data loss prevention. Now, the other thing that I won't talk about too much in here today, but the other thing that's also an important part of this overall conversation is, let's see, where does it fall under? I think we have to jump into policies. So the other thing as well then is around retention policies, because we don't, so normally it's like we need to keep content for a certain amount of time, but what we need to also start thinking about is, do we dispose of that content, or at least move it to a different location so that Copilot isn't going to be indexing it and making it available, for example, when it may be 7 or 8 or 10 years out of date, for example. So again, a lot of the stuff when it comes to labeling, to data lifecycle management, etc., a lot of these things are really, you've got to sort of figure out what works for your organization. But for the information protection, there are some defaults that are in there. I would probably recommend simplifying the defaults that are in there. So if we just sort of take a look at the default labels that are included, like now you can sort of see I've got a bunch of junk ones that I've dumped in here. So I need to sort of clean some of these things up. But what I'd sort of probably recommend here to start off with is where you can see things like confidential and highly confidential. Like I would probably start saying, don't have any that have got subcategories. So don't have confidential all employees, and confidential anyone. Just sort of start off with confidential, or even, so even if we get to the point where it's like, to get really simple to start off with, let's say we have personal, public, general, and confidential. So start off with 4 levels. And for general, that's something that I might make internal only, for example. So stuff we don't necessarily want out in the public, but not something that's really going to hurt us. But obviously there's a lot of other stuff here in Purview. The other thing that catches people out when they first start working with Purview is the concept of role. So they've changed the UI, so it gets a little bit more confusing, but it's the concept of role groups versus roles. Any of you who are used to working with Entra, AAD, etc., roles, how to work with roles, then you'll see a role mentioned and go, what on earth is that? I can't find it. And if it's related to Purview, more than likely it's a role group as opposed to a role. So just sort of little things that can cause issues in there. Now, I'll have to sort of stop here because we're basically bumped up into the 2 hours. So let me just sort of stop the recording here, and then we can just sort of switch over to any general Q&A. So let me just stop the recording.